understand that. The site is being optimized every single day, so it's getting better each and every day.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so it'll be nice and much smoother and won't take as much.
Genetically engineered a novel variant of the Peepo Robin Hood.
Thank you so much, 85D2D Derek. I will look at this afterwards. I am going to mute Donos for a moment so that we can do the interview. But I will look at this right afterwards, 85D2D Derek. Don't you worry. Oh my God, that does actually look amazing, though. I just saw it, but I'll show it off afterwards. 85D2D Derek. All right, let's do this. Very happy to have you.
Right.
Thank you so much for coming on.
No problem.
Yeah, welcome. And first off, do you want to give us your credentials? Give us your passions. What do you study? What are you interested in? And what would you love to talk to our chat about today?
Yeah, I am a current student studying political philosophy and labor studies, so probably the most based in Marx build thing you can study in university.
That is very based in Marx Pild.
I'm an admin at the RGR Discord. I'm become something of a theory consultant for a lot of people that a lot of people seem to want to talk leftist theory, and I'm always down to talk about that. I don't like people that posture about leftist theory, mostly because the people that posture about it don't seem to know what they're talking about.
True.
Typically, you'll find people that are massively educated on a subject usually don't like to talk down to people. When you're incredibly passionate about a subject, usually you want to get people into that subject. Usually you want to get people to learn that subject and get interested with you.
Yeah.
And that's what I like to do. I like to talk to people about anarchism, socialism, Marxism, all that type of stuff.
Well, that's incredibly awesome. And yeah, I tend to have a similar approach. I am not a super theory big brain, though I have read some theory. I have always been a bit more of a, let's see, how do we describe this? Like a hedge philosopher. I've just learned a lot of stuff from experience and from extensive readings of not necessarily direct philosophy texts, although I did used to be into philosophy a lot. Politically, I try to substantiate my arguments with as much data and whatnot, but I don't take myself too seriously. I advertise myself as a political edutainer.
Right, yeah.
I'm pretty open about being Oh, hey, Riley. Good to see you. Wait, Riley, let me get you a fancy name. Let me welcome Riley in with a fancy name. Good to see you in chat, Riley. But yeah, that's really awesome. And I have to say I appreciate that approach because there's for a lot of people, it is really difficult to get into theory. It's dense, right?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the whole? I mean, you've shared some of it as far as you don't think people should be snooty about it, but what are your thoughts? How would you encourage someone to be able to overcome the fear or the trepidation or the hesitation that can come with approaching theory in the first case? What would you recommend for people to start getting into that? And is there a way that can make it more approachable, et cetera, et cetera?
The way I generally tell people, and the way I generally tell people in university who usually start getting into philosophy, because when you get into different fields, you largely eventually branch into philosophy in that specific field, whether you're in the medical field, whether you're in the economics field, usually you encounter some sort of ethics along the way. Usually what I tell people to do and what I try and get people to do is I tell them you don't really have to read these big, thick books. It's great if you can, and it's great if you really want to, but there is an inordinate amount of lectures, essays online, short essays that you can read, and there's even YouTube channels of people that love to talk about this stuff. It's often hard to parse out which YouTube channels are actually educated and actually like to talk about this in an academic and educational context, and which ones are just posturing. But that's why we have communities to figure out what that sort of stuff is,
Yeah, and also the benefit is if you're too scared to approach or whatever, I don't want to call it scared because it sounds like I'm talking down to people, but I mean, I'm this way too. If I look at a huge book and I go, oh God, I can't digest that, but I could watch two different people's personal, like highly thought out essays about the subject with different takes, compare those and learn from it. And it might even inspire me to go read the original text in the first place. But those videos might only take me 2 hours to watch versus days of reading a book, which is kind of cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The one thing we've managed to do in the educational field, I say we, I don't major in education,
That's okay.
but the one thing that we're able to do is to be able to distill all this education down into an incredibly digestible format. You can study Hegel in a modern context, and you can study Kant in a modern context, even though these philosophers are like incredibly hard to parse for people just getting into it.
Yeah.
We have people that distill it down into introductory books or introductory lectures that are very, very easy to people grasping intro to ethics and intro to logic concepts, and they can get really into it that way. And I think a lot of YouTubers are good at that. I think particularly like channels like PhilosophyTube and ContraPoints have been fantastic at just getting people into the actual questions, whether it's talking about the fundamental flaws of capitalism, whether it's talking about like the dialectic of the relationship between a worker and an owner, or anything like that.
Yeah.
And then
I've personally
citing
found,
sources.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I didn't realize you had more to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want people to be able to have a starting point, and I want people to be able to have something to jump off of after that starting point, whether that's because every introductory book you'll read on a subject, whether it's ethics, logic, anarchism, communism, you'll always have citations in that introductory book to springboard off of. And even if it's like a PhilosophyTube or ContraPoints video, you'll always have citations in the description or often citations in the video to actually springboard off of so you can learn more about the subjects they talk about.
Yeah, this is actually something that I've talked about on my stream before, because I've told people, like, it's actually surprisingly less difficult to learn stuff if you get rid of the judgy, like the sort of like aura of judginess that sometimes is pervasive online, of like, you must go to the original texts or whatever. Well, you can start learning about a subject by just popping open the Wikipedia article, and then when you find something that's really interesting to you, go down to the sources and see what it is, and that will take you, they'll link you straight to it. You can just literally click and it will open up that original source so you can get what they're talking about. And like that can be of course, that shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of like how to get an authoritative position, but it can certainly start that process. And often starting that process is like the most toughest part. You know, a lot of people have a hard time just getting started on it, but once that natural curiosity gets sparked, you can go right through. You can start clicking into these different things, and sometimes you'll go in a whole rabbit hole and discover a whole bunch of stuff that you didn't think that you would before. I've found personally, you know, I have ADHD pretty bad. My chat knows about that. I joke about the square brain moments where my brain just goes like off into something else, which is great for streaming, but not so great for trying to sit down and read an academic text. However, I found that channels like you mentioned, I mean, I love PhilosophyTube, but also like channels like Radical Reviewer. I don't know if you're familiar with Radical Reviewer, but Radical Reviewer is a channel that I've found super valuable because it's like a book that I'm interested in reading that I've been like putting off, or that's on my list, but I've been like, you know, that hesitation is there. I can pick it up, get an idea of what's going on in this, and then go from there and follow those sources and learn about it more without necessarily having to read the original text, or perhaps I decide to read the original text. That happened with my reading of both State and Revolution, and my reading of Conquest of Bread, which I haven't finished yet, but I am working through it. So, but yeah, it's like it's really great, and it's an interesting way to build it seems to me like an inspiration cycle, almost like finding inspiration for art, but this time for learning. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We, as leftists, we need to find ways to get people into education, because ultimately leftism can only succeed if we educate people. I mean, the anarchist slogan is to agitate, educate, and organize. And whether you're an anarchist or not, you'd be hard pressed to find a leftist that wouldn't believe that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I value education, and like I just consider myself a lefty with like anarchist philosophical leanings. That's how I always describe
Sure.
myself. And but I find like education to be not just a passion, but something I believe in on a very deep level. That like, I mean, humans like our main like evolutionary advantage is that we can work together and teach each other stuff, that we are like not necessarily a blank slate, but that each generation can absorb and all of the errors, can learn from the errors of the last one, and we can get rid of the pratfalls of the previous generation. You know what I mean? Like that's incredible to me.
Absolutely.
So it always makes me so happy to hear that there are a lot of lefties out there who genuinely are inspired by education and want to make that a thing. So I'm very excited to hear that that's something that you're passionate about.
Yeah, we always need to educate people. I heard you said that you read The State and Revolution by Lenin.
Mm-hmm. I've
Nice.
read 75% of it. I have a little bit more to finish.
Okay.
But yeah, I've read a good chunk of it. I listened to that
it's more than most people have read.
True, yes, but I don't know. I get like I have this little notebook, and I have all my little notes on theory that I've read in here. I read, let's see, the last thing that I read was Reformism by Errico Malatesta. I really like Malatesta. I also read The Capitalist System by Bakunin. And then before that, I had a lot of notes on this. I listened to the entirety of Reform or Revolution by Luxemburg, and that was very enjoyable, really, really enjoyable to read. Again, these were audiobooks, which are available free online. I think there's like Audible Communist and Audible Anarchist have like relatively good quality. There's a couple misses in there. There's a couple of bad recordings or whatever, but mostly free, completely free and high quality recordings. And it's been very valuable for me personally, and I'm glad to see that there's a lot of people taking interest in it, and also finding ways to make this stuff available to people, because it is enriching. It is very empowering.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, something I want people to know that are interested in leftist theory, that a good 95, if not more, % of leftist theory is made by leftists, of course. So they wanted as many people to read it as possible. So these are all public domain, almost all of it. So you don't have to pay for it. You don't even have to acquire it illegally.
Yep.
You go over to the Anarchist library, you go to libcom.com, Marxist.org, wherever you want to go, and you can just read the entire works of Lenin, Marx, Engels, Rosa Luxemburg, Kropotkin, Malatesta, Bakunin, Proudhon, anyone you really want to read, or anyone you could even want to read about.
Yeah, it's incredible, these resources. And it's funny because like I'm glad we touched on this. Me being the paragon of a lefty, all of my videos are published in the under Creative Commons attribution license. Every video I make, and I've made a promise. So my chatters, who I call my imps will tell you that I always say this: my channel will always be free. I want anything that I do, anything that can be useful to people, to be free for everyone forever. It will never be paywalled. If you want to support me, you can, and there might be little like meaningless benefits. Like, for example, I have a pet. My dog, you can pet my dog digitally if you subscribe to my website, and like that's something silly and frivolous. There you go, you see it in the chat now. But some people are posting the Yoda pet. But yeah, those things are like, they're fun, but I never want my content to be limited. I want people to be able to access my content as easy as possible, and I find it strange that that's such an uncommon. It feels like such an uncommon thing. There's so much paywalling, and there's so much. This is especially true with like mainstream media, which isn't leftist by any means, but even by their own principles, it seems so backwards to want to paywall something that you want to propagate. That makes it harder to propagate. It's interesting to me.
Right, because they're bending to the modern mainstream to avoid the lefty terms, the neoliberal hellscape that we live in.
Yeah.
So now that not everyone is buying newspapers, and that's not the only way to get the news, they kind of have to survive off what little audience they have left, and just paywalling.
Yeah, it's wild too, because it's also interesting how I mean, this is a totally different topic, but nonetheless somewhat interesting. How this whole paywall era of online journalism was created because of just totally bad information from Facebook of all places, that the idea that video was really super important, and so all of these online journalistic outputs spent a ton of money building up video studios so they could produce video content that nobody even wanted from those sources. And of course, video content is great. I do video content, but people who were going to read a journal didn't want that video content, and all of a sudden they had to have it. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. All right, I got a challenging question for you, okay?
Gotcha.
I had a couple of prepared questions, and a couple of them I wanted to spin by you that I think would be valuable for the chat, if you're cool with me shooting a couple of questions your way.
No problem.
Yeah. So here's the question. Revolutionary anarchism has been the subject of, at best, public skepticism, and at worst, outright fear-mongering at the hands of representatives of the state. What are your thoughts on this, and can such trepidation be overcome? And if so, how?
Well, there's sort of two ways we can go about revolutionary anarchism. The first way is to just defiantly stand against the sort of fear-mongering that the right wing tells about it, and even some center-left liberals tell about it. The other way would be to Enrico Malatesta, who you brought up before, actually has really good writings on this, about how we as revolutionaries should form our revolutionary action in the public eye and not engage in a kind of subterfuge, and because we have a right to organize against the system, and we have a responsibility to organize against the system, and by organizing in public, we are asserting our positive rights to go against the system that subjugates us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. So basically the idea is that you should do it in the light of day because you're not doing anything worthy of hiding in the first place.
Right. If we then retreat to subterfuge, then we are allowing ourselves and we are allowing others to view us as doing something that we shouldn't be allowed to do.
Yes. Now, there's something interesting here that I've discussed. A couple of times on this channel that is an interesting parallel here. That's something I've found personally really important. And this is like, again, this isn't specifically touching on like anarchism or economic protest or economic organization, but I think it has some similar truths. And this is that the idea of like visibility being very important. I am a trans person, I'm a trans woman, like, and I'm also gay, and like, there is some truth to the idea that visibility is powerful, that just by people being brave enough to stand up and be themselves openly, although it often comes at a cost, at the end of the day, people are able to see themselves and see one another. And it means it's possible to get an idea of how many of you actually exist and how many people there actually are out there. And I think that that's actually very important. You know what I mean? Like, it allows you to get an idea for, if you're a gay person who is openly gay, and even if you get a lot of, negative feedback from that, you will find other people who are like you. Those people will flock to you. Those people will come, and it will build connections that can be stronger than any hate that can come your way in the long run. And it can change a society in my mind. So do you think that that's like a similar, like, do you think that parallel is valid, or is that
Oh no, absolutely. I think that's a great parallel. I talk all the time. There are a lot of people who are staunch Bernie supporters, and I like Bernie supporters. They're usually very progressive people, and they're usually cool people to talk to. And I don't know if you'd consider yourself a Bernie supporter. Like, that tends to come with some baggage.
I mean, I was a Bernie supporter when Bernie was still in the race. I mean, it depends on what you mean by Bernie supporter. I think Bernie's a great guy, and I was very impressed going to his rallies at the way that he structured them. And I had my critiques of Bernie, and my my bigger critiques, of course, of electoralism as a whole, which I have a lot of critiques with. But I think Bernie was, seems to me to be about as good of a politician as we've ever gotten in America, at least in any recent memory, who had a shot at the presidency. So that would have been cool, but it didn't happen.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So here's how I approach it. There are politicians and people like Bernie Sanders who can push for progressive change, and that's awesome. Bernie can push for things like trans civil rights. He can push for things like incorporating more reach out for minority groups. He can incorporate more things approaching economic democracy. Certainly, we wouldn't call it economic democracy, what he was proposing, but it was certainly more economically democratic than we have now. And there is the other side, which is us, maybe not you, because you're not an unknown, but people like me who are the people that don't have to adhere to optics to appeal to everybody. So I would be shooting myself in the foot to adhere to optics in the same way Bernie does.
Yeah, I
Does
agree.
that make sense?
Yeah, and
Because
I
20
likewise,
years
I would say
ago,
that too. Like, even for myself,
sure,
like my
yeah,
optics are not the same as Bernie's optics. We have different
absolutely.
objectives and different roles to play.
If you were to campaign 20 years ago, championing trans rights, nobody would have voted for you. Maybe some people would have voted for you, but you would have gotten destroyed in a landslide. Maybe not you. I'm saying the general you, whoever's running. And that's sort of what I tell to people. And obviously, we want to push for trans civil rights. And it's optically valid now, kind of, in America, to push for trans civil rights as a president. I mean, Biden's kind of doing it now, a little bit, maybe.
Compared to the last two presidents, I mean,
yeah, I mean, he's comparatively a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, he's you know, we've got the appointee. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but for the second highest position in the health department, which is really cool.
Yeah, it's a big change.
Yeah, it's big. And then also, I mean, as clumsy as it was, Joe Biden did go on, you know, national news with a lot of viewers and did say, like, we are going to stand by trans rights. And that's, if nothing else, it's a morale boost. For
Absolutely.
sure. So, yeah.
I think there's a way people think about politicians like this that is sort of backwards, where they think, oh, because Bernie was able to do so well, now we have so much more leftist power in America. And I would like to say, while that may be true, the reason Bernie was able to do so well is because so many leftists in America championed him and brought the progressive cause into the forefront in America.
Yeah.
Under the Obama presidency and under the Trump presidency.
Yeah. It's actually wild. Like, I've told this little anecdote about, you know, this occurred before Bernie was out. This was like probably was about February when this happened. And there's a really, here where I live, there's like a really active network of mostly anarchist mutual aid groups that have been doing really good work. I've done some work with them. They've really done some incredible efforts to bring material aid to people in the middle of a pandemic. And I remember this group went around to a bunch of neighborhoods in my area with a truck that had Bernie stickers all over it, and they were handing out like free just care packages with toothpaste, you know, toilet paper, everything that you would need. It was like toilet paper was really rare at that time because it was just the beginning of like when people were starting to like really get the idea that coronavirus was a thing. And they came by and they weren't pushing any political message, but they had, hey, here's a little booklet that tells you about your rights as a tenant, where you can get some help as a tenant. Here's a, you know, little Bernie sticker if you want it. They weren't associated with the Bernie campaign. These were just people who wanted to help and like also saw that as an opportunity to like be a little, you know, hey, here's our politics too. And I think that was amazing.
Yeah.
And that effort, like that sort of stuff sticks with people. Like I remember people coming out to get food in their neighborhood and just going like, wow, actually, hey. Yeah.
This is how you build political power in the small scale. If you look at even radical political organizations like the Black Panthers, if you want disenfranchised groups to get on your side, then you help those disenfranchised groups.
Precisely.
You don't say that you're going to help them and hope that they choose you as their leader. You help them.
Yep.
And then they join you, and then they rally behind you.
Yeah, and
this is what happens.
It literally empowered them. You have to empower them first. Like, yeah, it's a trust thing, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have another question for you, if you're cool for another question.
Absolutely.
So now this is a little bit more of a general question. Obviously, I personally know some of this, but I think some people who are not yet to be like who don't necessarily know how they feel about anarchism or anarchist philosophy might benefit from this sort of question. In your mind and in your studies, what are the short-term and the long-term goals of anarchists, and what sort of victories, as a follow-up to that, after you answer that first one, what sort of victories do you think should anarchist-leaning people work towards?
Okay. So, as a rule, many anarchists, and most Marxists would agree with the idea that we can't really conceptualize an end state, but we are always pushing towards perfection. Does that make sense? In the
Yeah,
same way that
absolutely.
I will always push towards perfection in myself, but I'll obviously never achieve perfection,
Correct.
we'll always push to be better and better and better.
Mhm.
So in that way, we will always push for more egalitarian institutions, whether that be economically or socially, preferably both. We would want no coercion in society, so long as it benefits the positive and negative freedoms of the citizenry. Things like that.
Mhm.
Many anarchists conceptualize anarchism as different things. Many people think of it as the absence of unjust hierarchies in the collective. Uh, I would agree with that, but I would say it's also more that we do not tolerate any sort of social or economic subjugation or coercion
Yes.
by any sort of
Yeah.
top-down authority. And furthermore, that we champion the positive liberty of people, that being people's liberty to do things.
Mhm.
We don't have any value if we have freedom from things, if we don't have freedom to do things. Does that make sense?
Correct. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I've heard this discussion gone back and forth on Twitter and beyond. This idea of like, I know there are some anarchists who really bristle at the I don't know if it's right to call it the Chomskyan, but the like sort of Chomsky definition of anarchy is like, oh, no unjustified hierarchies, because it's like, well, but you can justify any hierarchy if you try hard enough. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure, yeah.
yeah,
Like there's if you say to someone like if you believe that unjust hierarchies are bad, then you're an anarchist. It was like that kind of like falls to like almost everybody. Like if you ask a conservative, "Hey, do you think unjust hierarchies are good?" They're probably going to be like, "Well, I don't think unjust things are good. That sounds pretty bad. I guess I'm against that."
yeah. And also, I've this is really funny. We could probably talk about this more, but there's this one thing that's always irked me. It's one conversation about like pulling a child out from in front of a car. Like, oh, I hate that. It gets me so bad because people are like,
Oh,
oh,
like
that's a hierarchy, and it's like,
the
no,
hierarchy of a parent and a
we're talking
child.
about political hierarchies. Like, what do you mean? Like, there shouldn't be a hierarchy between parent and child, like a political hierarchy between parent and child. There might be a like unavoidable like child cannot survive without parent because of like a biological limit, but that's not a political hierarchy. That's not something that should be enforced by a society of like a parent being dominant over a child. And I find it
Sure,
more
like
interesting,
yeah.
in general, to look at anarchy as a position of attempting to remove dominance and remove subjugation, which is why I was very interested to hear you use those terms, because I always find that a more interesting way of approaching the question.
Absolutely. There will always be forms of authority,
Mm-hmm.
insofar as there will be authority figures, as far as like there will be people more educated than you or I on things
Mm-hmm.
like medicine. We can't all be doctors as much as we all want to be equal,
Mm-hmm.
but we want to be treated equal and we want to be people be studied in different things, obviously. We can't all be jacks of all trades.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
And
we
things
need
like
specialization, and specialization is only going to increase in the future, I imagine, as our society becomes more
absolutely.
complex. But
And
see,
things
again, then with
like a
something like that,
parent
oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, with something like that, to me, I don't think that meets like a reasonable definition of like a political hierarchy of saying like, hey, someone who has years of expertise, who literally has information on something, should be probably deferred to for your own good on certain topics, on those topics of expertise. That's not to me an idea of dominance or of building that into a like a state that would enforce some sort of like technocratic, like the scientists are in charge of everything or they get to decide everything. No, it's like, okay, a doctor knows how to fix something and they have a purpose for having that knowledge, and why you would trust a doctor with that as opposed to them being able to forcibly, I don't know, do surgeries on you or something like that, if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah. Like I would consider a parent and child the same type of authority figure as like if my friend drives me to the store
Mm-hmm.
and then he's driving the car.
Yeah.
And then like, okay, he has the authority over where we go. We're not equal in that sense, but we're both human beings. So there's not like we don't need to postulate over the philosophy of, should we both get to hold the wheel and everything like that?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no sort of dominance or subjugation. He's not keeping me in that situation
Right.
in the way that like say a worker and a boss would be, or a landowner and a tenant would be.
Mm-hmm.
One
Yeah.
necessarily relies on the other to be under them.
Yeah, there's a specific exploitation. And I actually had an interesting conversation on this topic with a distributist, which I've always found that a little bit of a complicated philosophy to really understand what they're getting at, because at the end of the day, it usually just seems like you end up just being under the Pope. I don't know, but whatever. This conversation I had, I'm like, in an ideal circumstance, there would not be a political hierarchy between a parent and child. Parent and child's in the eye of society should be considered equals, and a parent that is violating the trust of a child should be frowned upon, right? Like we should look down upon, or not necessarily
Sure.
look down, but we should
Yeah.
discourage as a society a parent who is taking advantage of their child or exploiting their child, because there shouldn't be a class between parent and child. These should be both individuals that are just perhaps at different points of their biological development, but that doesn't mean that you have your society grant some sort of like if what's the right word for this, like a societal role that's given as like, oh, the parent must be deferred to at all times. No, the parent has a responsibility and a trust relationship with their child, something along those lines.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Parents would be something that are a type of people that we would classify as people that provide a type of positive freedom
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that like a medical institution would be. Anarchists wouldn't look at, say, doctors in medical institutions saying, like, they're hogging all the medical supplies from us. I mean, probably in America they would. I live in Canada where we have public health care, so we
Yeah.
don't really have to worry about this.
Whew. That's a nice one. That's a nice benefit to have during this time of hardship here in
Yeah, I'm very
America.
sorry
It's
about
very
that.
it's
But yeah, a baby on its own isn't really going to have many freedoms,
mm-hmm.
even if you don't touch the baby, even if nobody fucks with the baby.
Yeah.
The baby's not going to be getting very far very fast. So the parent is there to provide positive freedoms, be able to get the baby food, get the baby rest, get the baby shelter, and teach the baby how to speak and walk and do all the things a baby needs to do.
Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of the conversation, unfortunately, I mean, this is most conversation online in general, but I think a lot of the conversation around anarchy fixates on really bad faith situations that are meant to be more like a riddle, as opposed to an actual political question of like, oh, well, then in an anarchist society, if you don't believe in hierarchies, well, then you shouldn't be able to rescue a child from getting hit by a truck. It's like, no, that is not what any of this means. Like, that is
It's
clearly like,
true.
but yeah, yeah, so that was one of it. And then again, just to reiterate the second part of the question, what sorts of, on a political level, on a like sort of day-to-day level, looking at what we're going into now and the complicated situation we're in, what type of victories do you think that like we should be aiming for people who are left-leaning, but also people who might consider themselves anarchists? What should they be looking for, and what should they be working towards in your mind?
Gotcha. So, as a rule, I don't put my faith in electoral institutions. I vote.
Mm-hmm.
I vote for the most progressive candidate. And then I organize on the ground, online, in real life, wherever I can. I help out organizations, join organizations, do work on the street, do work online, wherever I can, to be able to build power from a bottom level. So people do not need to rely on a state authority to be able to sustain themselves. So there's the concept in liberalism that the more responsibility a state has to uh, give sustenance to the citizenry, then the more authority the state has. And that's to a great degree true, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if the state has all control over medical care, all control over optical, dental, all control over even the economy, like we see in something like Soviet Russia,
Mm-hmm.
then the state has all the control to be able to come in and shut all this stuff down when they feel like that the people are getting out of line or whenever they want to control the populace.
Yeah. For me, I've in my thoughts on anarchist philosophy and whatnot, I've always thought a sort of important thing to focus on is building distributed and sustainable power. And something
Absolutely.
I talk about a lot, and maybe you can provide your insight as much more academically versed than I am, but I've always seen that the goal of anarchists and anarchist leaning folks should be to build systems that are not easily hijacked or corruptible, that we should try to build if power structures power must be wielded at some point, but if power must be wielded, it should be done so in the way that puts it in the hands of as many people as possible, as efficiently as possible. And we want to try and get the perfect balance between those things. We here in America, we have a lot of institutions that at the end of the day, even though they might be pseudo-democratic institutions or the product of a pseudo-democratic state, do at the end of the day fall down to the hands of a very small amount of people who get to determine whether those agencies are going to function. One such example is the United States Postal Service. That's one that to me seems like one of the most obvious examples where it is incredibly easy for a president or for a single faction of Congress to gain a little bit of power and completely destroy something that is desperately needed for the public to function and communicate with one another. And to me, at least from what I understand of anarchism, the idea would be to aim to structure these things, not that they shouldn't exist or that everything, there's this ANCAP thing of like, oh, well, I should start my own postal service. Well, it's like, no, not necessarily, but instead we should aim to structure the postal service in such a way that it is as hard as possible to be hijacked by a single power. This is a public good that should be able to continue to sustain itself in a distributed manner without any sort of tyrannical control over it. I don't know if that makes sense in a more academic sense, but.
Oh, yeah, totally. So there's a thing that many countries tried to do. Some of them failed, some of them succeeded. It was actually originally a Leninist plan. It's weird with Lenin. There are a lot of anarchists, or particularly young anarchists, who will kind of like turn their nose up at anything Lenin wrote. But I do want to tell people that like Lenin did have a lot of good insights as far as Marxist analysis of the world at the time, specifically in things like imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. I do encourage people to read Lenin, even if they're anarchists, if they're not anarchists. I encourage people to like read as much as they can.
Yeah. I mean, and again, like I've found a lot of value from reading. Again, State and Revolution was very interesting to me. Reform versus Revolution by Luxemburg is, not an anarchist, a social democrat. You know what I mean, right? Yeah, a social democrat. But like nonetheless was very valuable in understanding like and conceptualizing certain concepts. I think an understanding of imperialism is incredibly valuable, regardless of who penned the pages that point out the facts about imperialism, because boy, oh boy, is that an important concept to understand in the modern age of American imperialism.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I tend to agree with you on that.
Yeah. Basically any leftist philosopher, any leftist political theorist from anywhere around that era, you're not going to like all their takes.
Of course.
Even if you'll read anarchists like Bakunin or Proudhon, once they start talking about women, it's not a fun time.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But the important thing that we can do is we can take their good takes and be like, wow, that's a good take. And then apply that to our own political philosophy. And then take their bad takes and be like, wow, shit take, Lenin. I really don't think that we need to actually purge people from a mass workers' party in order to keep ideological purity. That doesn't sound very cool.
Yeah,
they're very poggers.
It's definitively unpog. I'm not a big fan of the purging part. I mean, and of course, there's always like one thing to always keep in mind is like at the end of the day, there's no one theorist should be your um, where you draw all
Absolutely.
your info from, and it can be valuable to learn from these. I mean, I don't think any theorist would want, or very few. There are some people who are very culty who would probably like it very much if you listened only to
Probably.
them. But
Marx and Engels themselves didn't want people to pathologize their work. Marx and Engels themselves talked about that people shouldn't treat economic class as the one means of political liberation.
yeah, and I think that generally, at least for me, in reading anything, I always am very nervous about anyone who asks me to take their word only as the final answer. So I think that can be. I mean, again, I have a unique background. I grew up in a cult, so I am very
Absolutely.
yeah, I'm very sensitive and watchful of that sort of thing.
No problem.
But
Well, hey,
yeah,
I got citations for everything I'm talking about here. Don't
hey, that's
worry.
awesome.
So don't take my word for it, by all means.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I think you've done a very good job expressing, your level of expertise and your interest, and it's been really, really awesome. I do have another quick question for you, if
No problem.
you're down for a few more. I think we've had a couple of audience questions as well, but this one is, if you were to give advice to my audience, and my audience has actually quite a broad range of age groups and demographics, etc. What is your advice on how people can most readily educate themselves and get involved in things like mutual aid?
Okay, so contrary to popular belief, if you live in an area that isn't literally like Alaska or something, like rural Alaska, you almost certainly have some sort of housing co-op, mutual aid foundation, community organization, as far as like libertarian socialist, anarchist, libertarian communist, something like that. You almost certainly have something like that around you. If you don't, you can organize online or you can start one yourself with your friends. If you don't have many friends, then you still have online. But almost certainly people do have things like that around them. So I do encourage people to look that up. But if people are wanting to convince, say, their friends into something like communism, anarchism, or just general leftism, honestly, the secret is just friendship. Like, unironically, you become friends with people, and people tend to adopt their friends' political ideologies. People are way more likely to listen to you if you're friends with them.
Yeah.
Like, I do unironically talk about how like friendship is the key to leftism.
I tend to agree, believe it or not. I know it's kind of it sounds a little softy and a little woo, but it is true. Like, I think there is a truth in the idea that building connections is like the foundation of society. You need to be able to connect with other people, and friendship
Mm-hmm.
is that connection. Like friendship
Absolutely.
or friendliness, even if you can't be a friend to everyone, but being able to understand and come to a sort of with as many people as possible, a sort of like gregarious understanding of one another is incredibly valuable, and it really does wonders for being able to make a society that can get along with one another. So yeah.
Absolutely. It's what we got to do. We got to become friends with people. Or if not friends, just build bonds with people. Find ways that you can work with people, become acquaintances with people. Find ways to work with people. Even if you don't like them a ton, maybe you'll have benefits of working with them.
Yeah.
I also encourage people to not I'm a very anti-sectarian leftist myself, so even though I usually describe myself as a libertarian communist, uh, anarchist would also be correct to describe me as. I study revolutionary anarchism and Marxism
Mm-hmm.
primarily. I really don't like people that hear the word Marxist-Leninist and immediately assume, oh, you are an apologist for all the atrocities of China.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I hate the people that assume anarchists would be like, oh, wow, you're just a little baby anarchist. You haven't come around to the real ideology yet.
Yeah, this is something that has been an ongoing question. In fact, I wanted to ask you about that a little bit as a spicy final question. So maybe we'll come back to that one if that's all right. Do you mind if I ask you two questions I've gotten from chat real quick?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so the first question, how do you feel it is the most, or what do you feel is the most effective way to quickly articulate the difference between a government and a state to people who essentialize states and equate the two?
Honestly, it will depend on which anarchist you ask, but we would talk about, in terms of governmental organizations in an anarchist society, we would talk about organizing in terms of direct democracy. Like, direct democracy is something that anarchists really love to talk about. Essentially, the foundation of direct democracy is that in a representative democracy, the representatives you elect are bound to corruption. You know, you can pay them off, you can bribe them, you can threaten them in order to do what you want, and they aren't necessarily beholden to the populace. And with direct democracy, you don't have to worry about that because the people that make decisions are the populace.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, I guess if you could articulate it in like a Hank Green, John Green SciShow episode, is if you just showed like a triangular political hierarchy and then just like cut the top off with a knife to where it's just all flat at the end, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly I like to talk to people about how we can organize things in a more democratic, radically democratic way in order to actually decentralize power in the hands of as many people as possible.
That's something I like to
So,
focus on too. Yeah.
absolutely, democracy is. I say that about people talk about this all the time as a meme with market socialists and everything with the democratically elected CEO and everything.
Yes.
But democracy really does help a lot of issues. There's even data that I have collected on my Discord that shows that democracy, institutional democracy in both the economy and the state leads to a higher GDP and things like that, which is something that would even be wanted in a liberal democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's interesting too because there's this sort of constant fear mongering of like, but what about the rule of the mob? Well, I mean, you don't really have as much to worry about a mob if people are generally taken care of and if people are educated on what their circumstances are. Like, sure, people will come to wrong conclusions, but you're significantly less likely to see the sort of brutal, cutthroat politics that we see right now when power isn't as totalitarian, when you can't just take one role and dominate all kinds of other people. There's the tension is greatly reduced in the first place. So the power jockeying becomes significantly more about whatever you're actually supposed to accomplish as opposed to acquiring the power in the first place.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the other question was, what are your thoughts on participatory economics in post-capitalist system, particularly in the context of filling undesirable jobs?
Filling undesirable jobs. So I assume that'll be janitors, people that clean toilets, jobs that people don't generally want to do.
Probably stuff along those lines. Yeah, that would be a fair assumption. I'd
Okay,
say like
sure.
like the sewage worker stuff. Yeah.
There is a lot of theories behind that. Some theories is that these things would be taken over communally. Whether things like people rotate out and be like, okay, I am the one cleaning today, you are the one cleaning today, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people take it to be maybe these people for more undesirable jobs or more risky jobs. They would be compensated higher, whether like with better sustenance or more entertainment at the end of the day. Because in an anarchist society, in a communist society, people are still going to labor. And people are still going to enjoy the fruits of their labor, of course. People will always enjoy the fruits of their labor, hypothetically in a leftist society.
Yeah. And I mean, I've talked about this from my position as well. I've worked a lot of dirty jobs. Like, I've worked a lot of jobs in my life, and I've worked dirty jobs. And, like, the worst part of the dirty job isn't usually the job. It's the fact that it's thankless or stigmatized. The dirty, everybody, I mean, if you've ever lived in like a harmonious household, like with people that you like, it's not all that hard to do. It's not really all that hard to do undesirable chores. Like, yeah, there's probably a little bit of reluctance because it kind of sucks, but like, it's usually pretty easy in the name of like, hey, there's a reward for it. Like, we all live harmoniously as a result of this. and we can
Absolutely.
ask for help and whatever. Like, and also I think another thing too that like some people discount is that like ideally, you know, we should stop in a bigger picture, we should probably stop being afraid of automation. And if we can build a society where we no longer have to be afraid of automation, we can automate a lot of really dirty jobs forever
Oh yeah,
away.
automation is incredible.
Yeah.
Innovation is liberation, which is a big part of modern anarchist and communist theory.
Mm-hmm.
Is that innovation will liberate us necessarily,
Yeah.
even if capitalism is benefiting off of something, necessarily the populace can benefit off it in the
Mm-hmm.
same way that it benefits the small group of people at the top of society.
Hopefully,
So,
barring complete capture. I think there are some terrifying scenarios of like sort of doomsday corporate capture scenarios, but
absolutely.
yeah, but those are kind of, yeah, neither here nor there.
There are, but to be a leftist, we have to take in a sort of optimism that most people don't really have, right?
I agree. Yes, very much about the bloomer fuel,
So,
the bloomer
yeah,
fuel. You can ask my chat. I talk about it all the time.
absolutely. I'm very hope-filled myself.
Yeah, likewise.
So, the undesirable jobs is actually something that we do right now in society. If you think of things like nurses go through fucking hell in their jobs,
Yeah.
but nurses are people like, not everyone, but people are very, very like loving of like nurses because nurses are the ones who take care of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the same way, being in the military is pretty fucking hard work, and it's not very fun to actually be in the line of duty. As much as we don't like the military, it's not like it's a ball for the people over stationed in different countries,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Not at all.
But people like these jobs,
Mm-hmm.
and they are thanked for these jobs because these jobs are sort of venerated by society in a way that things like janitors just aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And that I would see as a problem with society as a whole. And we even have jobs that are more risky, like people that weld pipes underwater and things like that, or people that do construction way up high in the sky of like electrical towers and the like. And we compensate those people more for the risk.
Yeah. I
So
think
I
that's
very much feel like we would do that in a more egalitarian society, if not more so.
yeah, I think so as well. I've always felt that like people are extremely fixated on money as the only reward. But like yet we have many structures that currently exist under capitalism that show that money isn't the only thing that people seek. I always point to one of my go-to is always video game modding, which is like
Hmm.
people will devote their lives to creating the most incredible mods you can possibly imagine, mind-blowing game design, like game design that you probably could make a lot of money off of, and they give it away for free. and
Right.
and
Because
it's
they
like,
love it.
and because they love it and they love the what they're creating, and they love the community, and the community loves them, and often their community will take care of them if they have needs that come up. I think that's amazing, and I think we should use
Yeah.
that sort of thing as an inspiration to us, that we actually can, like, if humans can trust each other just a little bit, we actually can build really awesome structures. And yeah, it's yeah, I think you're spot on about that.
100%.
um
Even if you look in almost said the real world. Obviously, modders are in the real world.
yeah.
But if you look at like a modern economic example that is very anomalous
Mm-hmm.
as far as sociological trends of capitalism go, is the modern American education institution. Is that if you ask any teacher in a high school or a middle school or an elementary school why they decided to be a teacher, how many of them are you think are going to say they wanted a good paycheck? They
None of
do it
them.
because they love it.
Yep.
Most
Yep.
teachers I've met, and most teachers I guarantee most people have met, have probably paid out of pocket for stuff in their classroom
Yep.
and books for their students and supplies for their students. The education system in America and in my country, Canada, and in many countries in Europe largely is funded publicly and by the teachers themselves.
Yeah.
The teachers themselves are propping up the education industry.
Yeah, it's wild. I've the school that I went to for high school was this weird, like, pseudo private school that had a deal with the state. It's really complicated, but the fact of the matter is that their teachers made nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And like, and some of the most genuinely life teachers who changed my life. My English teacher, for example, was like, had been teaching there for decades and changed my life with how good of a teacher he was. And he did it for nothing. He
Yeah.
got nothing for it. He got the most pathetic pay you could imagine. It was sad how little he got paid, but he did it because he was passionate
Yeah.
about teaching and because he got to see generations of students benefit from what he did. So yeah.
Yeah. And it's really, really sad to see, like, I have met so many great teachers in my lifetime, and I have met teachers that treated me like shit. But
Yeah.
also, those teachers that treated me like shit, I would hear stories about from the people that were taught by them earlier,
Mm-hmm.
like 10 years earlier or so, and they would tell me how awesome they were.
Yeah.
And I was just left with the feeling knowing, wow, at one point this person was a really awesome, nice person, and now they're incredibly jaded to the point where they treat students like shit. And while that is unjustifiable, how fucked up must their situation be to have jaded them that much to the thing that was once their passion and their drive in life?
Yeah. I mean, people get ground down. I mean, this is a story of, geez, like if we want to talk about general, like, like work things under capitalism, God, like, I mean, I know more people than I can count who have genuinely loved a field that they worked in and been burnt out and come to hate it because of how it was not because the work was bad, not because even the industry itself was bad, but because their compensation was bad, and it led to them living a constantly stressful life in addition to whatever stressors they had on the job. And yeah, it's really unfortunate that we approach things this way, in my opinion. Yeah. So if you've got a little bit of time left, I'd love to hit you with a couple of little spicy. Because what would be a Demon Mama show without just a tiny bit of spice? You cool with a
Okay.
few little spicy questions?
Yeah, I gotcha.
All right, cool. All right, so the first one. How do you feel about the latest rise of, if we're charitable, highly economically focused, if we're honest, class reductionist factions on the online left specifically? Do you have any thoughts about these things, and what would you say to somebody who was, offering you a class reductionist approach to politics?
I would largely tell them to read Marx, because Marx would probably hate every single one of their opinions. That's usually what I do what I talk about when I talk to class reductionists.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of work on this in terms of Marxism most of the time. The last 3 class reductionists that I talked to have all talked to me about Marxism. At the end of the conversation, they end up admitting that they've never read any Marxism in their life. And this
Love how
always
that
tends
works
to
out.
happen. Yeah, it always tends to happen. And it always tends to happen that they got radicalized by some Discord that they're in, or by some YouTuber that they watch. And there are a lot of great Marxist YouTubers, so I don't want people to start thinking that Marxist YouTube is indoctrinating people. But we will have pretty bad YouTubers that are indoctrinating people, like anything.
Yeah.
But I would mostly point them towards Engels talking about how. Okay, so there's a thing Engels talks about where if economic struggle is the only struggle that we should focus on, then there necessarily would not be any Marxist text beyond what Marx and Engels originally wrote, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there'd be no more to figure it out. They already did it. The proletariat and the bourgeoisie is the dialectic. We have to overcome this dialectic. But then Marxist philosophers and Marxist political theorists came afterwards, like Frantz Fanon and Angela Davis, and said, hey, well, we are black people subjugated in colonial countries, where we are an oppressed group. We literally don't have the same rights as white people. We aren't even let into the dialectic of proletariat and bourgeoisie. We are an even more oppressed class.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the Jim Crow days, the black people were treated as the lumpen proletariat, which is a Marxist concept of a proletariat that is even more disenfranchised and has to resort to things like petty theft, crime, drug dealing, prostitution in order to actually pay for themselves instead of actually working some sort of industrial job
Yeah.
or service job.
Which sounds like an increasingly large percentage of Americans working in the gig economy these days.
Right. It's very much comparable.
Mm-hmm.
This is what things like the Black Panther Party wrote about. This is what things like Angela Davis wrote about, Bill Fletcher, things what Kwame Ture talked about, and even Engels and Marx themselves talked about it. Frantz Fanon talked about it. Many Marxist writers have, and this is only to say what the class reductionists talk about as far as the more authoritarian communists, but there is a interesting problem of anarchist class reductionists that is increasingly like very, very weird to me because they don't take the same approach to class reductionism as the more authoritarian leftists.
Yeah.
Where
As I
the
say,
more
most that I'm
authoritarian
familiar with are more authoritarian types. They're like
yeah, they're very brazen about it.
Yeah. Oh,
Where...
for sure. I mean, you have things like the highly the highly turf organization in the UK. There's a Marxist org that's like super into turfs, and it's like they're I can't remember which one it is. I always forget the two acronyms. There's two like major Marxist parties, and one of them is like really into turf stuff, and they're super loud about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, they often can be. Yeah, in anarchism, I find a lot of people, and even some writers, can say things like, I mean, if you look at Proudhon and Bakunin, they very much thought that women should be mothers of the revolution, and that they should raise young revolutionaries, and that the women's place was in the home to raise young revolutionaries. That was what they conceptualized as anarchist praxis at the time.
Very, very limited. See, and that's always been my one of my big gripes with the reductionist crowd, which is that there seems to just be an incredible short-sightedness to it, and ultimately the ask at the end of the day is please grit your teeth and bear whatever hardship we say in the name of the revolution TM. And it's like, whatever your brand of revolution is, well, we need to get to this. This is the greater good. So, if you wouldn't mind just going and making us a sandwich so that we can continue doing the revolution, that'd be grand. You know what I mean? It's that sort of like almost conceited, assumptive, entitled approach.
Exactly. The we'll get to your rights after we secure the revolution type people.
Yeah. And then, of course, this leads to the second spicy question of the night, which is... which would be to provide. I would ask you if you had a, and it doesn't need to necessarily be super spicy, but if you had a critique of, or if you were to present a critique to more authoritarian style communists, maybe even like the MLs online. For me, at least personally, I feel like I encounter a lot of that sort of thing, of this sort of like, well, trust us, it's going to be okay, your rights are going to be assured after the fact. But then I don't see it actually being put into action. I see groups that are, heavily patriarchal or even racist, and those are often buried under. So if you were to bring a critique to these sort of authoritarian groups, or if you could bring out a salient critique, what would you say to them as to why they should consider a little bit of what the anarchists are saying?
I would say to any authoritarian leftists that I understand and I hope that most of you do want to push for the same fundamental values that I do, for liberty for all, equality for all, and prosperity for all. But I do not think that your way will get us there, and I do not think that your way has got us there any step closer than we have had now. I do not believe that the USSR, even if Stalin did not take over, say we had Trotsky, say Lenin just didn't even die, and Lenin somehow lived on to see it through to today, I do not believe they would have achieved socialism. Because fundamentally, socialism needs the public ownership of the means of production, which the USSR never facilitated.
Yeah.
The USSR's means of production were owned by the state, which was very much not conceptualized by Marx. Even in the lower phase communism part of what he talked about it in Critique of the Gotha Program, Marx specifically talked about the means of production being owned by the proletariat, and the means of production in the USSR were owned by the Bolshevik Party. And you can offer a type of state capitalist perspective, because that is what they had. And that's not a criticism of the USSR. Lenin called it state capitalism. State capitalism was meant to be a transition to socialism, where the state takes over industry, and the state reaps the profits of the industry, and they use that profit to create more industry. That's how they plan to industrialize so fast, and largely, they actually did industrialize pretty fast. But it did eventually devolve into a very despotic dictatorship.
Yeah.
And that's something we don't want. And fundamentally, we do not believe in achieving, even if you would like to call the USSR in its prime, so to speak, even if you would like to call that socialism, we as leftists should not strive for socialism at any cost. We should strive for socialism as a means of liberation, not socialism as a pathology.
Yeah. And that's interesting because it's very similar to some of the critiques that I would bring, which is, obviously not nearly as well worded or cited, but my concern has always been that there is a structural flaw in the authoritarian approach to communism, which leaves a gaping, a gaping vulnerability of how easy it is to ultimately never make that transition to socialism, from trusting a vanguard party with all the resources. It's easy to never make the change. And if you can't have that trust, if the people can't have that trust, well, then how are they going to get behind your program? And if your program has that vulnerability on a systemic level, which I would argue that authoritarian approaches do, then how do you fix that vulnerability? And my argument would be, of course, well, you need to make sure that the power is distributed in the first place, that the structure that you build isn't so easy to hijack, so doesn't have that vulnerability. But anyway, I really appreciate that. Did you that's all the questions I have. Did you have any questions for me? I don't know if you do. I'm just a political edutainer on the internet, but if you have any questions for me, I would love to give you the opportunity to sort of shoot them at me, and I can try and answer them to the best of my ability, and then we can call it good for the night.
Gotcha. I was very curious, because I know you're a Bernie supporter. I'm very curious on your approach to achieving socialism, and how you think that what would you say would be the most effective way of achieving socialism?
Yeah, I mean, God, that's a really tough question. That's probably a little out of my wheelhouse, but at least as I don't know if I'm as big brain as to be able to say that, but yeah.
To be clear, nobody knows really what the most effective way of achieving socialism is. Just like what your general idea is, and what you push for as far as socialism.
My general approach is, the sort of first thing I look at is, at least from my perspective, is education needs to be the primary focus. I actually have a little board over here that I drew out my sort of goals when I was making my channel, knowing that I was going to do lefty politics, that I wanted to have some things there. And one of them was, like, I think, at least for me, one of the most important things right now is to be able to create a salient and strong counter narrative to the predominant narratives of our society, that to show people that there actually are other possibilities to sort of end the mentality of the capitalist realist mentality through education and maybe even entertainment, by getting people to think about different societies that are possible. That's one of the big things. I think we are at a point where a lot of people, their minds they can't visualize anything but the society that we live in. And I think the first part to changing that is getting as many people as possible to believe that it is possible for us to live a different way than we do right now, a better way. And so that's a big focus for me, is just in raw education and in stimulating the minds and the imaginations of people in my community, in the country as a whole. I think we need to cross that threshold first. So that's a huge focus for me, is broadening people's perspectives and getting them to think about it. And then, following from that, I think another thing is community building is a huge deal for me. And I believe very much in, we all are stuck in a capitalist system. We have to struggle to build communities because there is this pressure of alienation. There is this pressure of keeping you working all the time so that you can never have friends. So you can never have families of choice. You can never have communities that are enriching to you. But I think we can go against that, and we can resist, and we can build these communities, and we can structure them in such a way that they can be empowering. Everything from, again, I try to keep my scope, a little small because I don't want to overstate it, but like my community is designed to be a tiny pocket of the internet that allows people to find access to stuff that will empower them creatively, to stuff that will empower them politically, to stuff that will inspire them and make them laugh. Like, that's my goal, and creating that community and making it as sustainable and just as possible, and then using that community to empower other communities or to direct towards politics is like a big step for me. So I think actually building communities again that don't necessarily look like the ones that we imagined in the past, that aren't necessarily just neighborhoods, but they might be digital communities, but digital communities nonetheless can have a material impact if they're able to, if I'm able to make a channel on my Discord that has programmers talking together, and somebody joins my Discord who's an expert programmer and can teach a bunch of people who've joined this Discord how to program or how to fix a single problem. Hey, that's a problem solved. And so that's one of the other things that I focus on a lot. And then third is like I guess as an extension of that is like I tend to talk about mutual aid a lot. I think this is really important. I believe that mutual aid isn't just like I'm going out to a soup kitchen, though that is definitely a really good form of it. I think that mutual aid can be, hey, like I've connected with these people in my community and I have something that I can help them with that will allow them to then help others, and we can raise a community up out of poverty or out of lack of education or whatever together. And there's a lot of ways to do that, and I try to come up with as many creative ways as I can. And then, of course, a fourth thing that I do talk about news a lot. I do talk and analyze electoral politics. And so my goal in talking about, the sort of, boring politics is, one, to make it as interesting as possible and to provide a different perspective on it that allows people to understand that, hey, like, you don't have to play by all of these rules necessarily. Like, there are ways to, be smart be strategic in politics. It doesn't involve just going out every 4 years and voting, but there are times where by being tuned into what's going on, you can take collective action. There might be some key votes that matter, and that vote could open the door for all kinds of changes. Like, for example, I advocate pretty strongly for opportunistically pressuring politicians to adopting certain types of legislation that could be very, very valuable in actually making headway towards a more democratic system. One such example is like ranked choice voting makes our voting system significantly more open, and also opens up the opportunity to having different types of perspectives appearing on the ballot at all, which that's not like my main focus, but this is something that I try to do. Is I try to I try to encourage people to not just get lost in this sort of eternal electoral cycle of like the bullshit, but to instead say, hey, maybe there are some parts of this electoral system that we can laser target and we can direct a bunch of energy at, and we can actually make a change that would matter and that can open up and make our lives materially better. Stuff like that. So that's a bit of a long way of answering the question, but I want it to be as thorough as possible.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think we should have more people doing that, championing education. I think entertainment's a great way to do that. I do think there's plenty of people that sort of blend education and entertainment in a really great way. I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that edutainment is any real lesser education. I think if we talk about how many people have been, super emboldened by people like Bill Nye the Science Guy, and people meme about it, but like genuinely,
Or Carl
he's gotten
Sagan.
plenty of people into science. Carl Sagan, things like that.
Yeah, I tend to believe that like political edutainment is not necessarily a lesser, but just a different type, and it needs to be understood for what it is. You know, as you can see by my silly bear head I have in the background, if you come in a segment and I'm memeing about having with a Fortnite bear head on my head and I'm making fun of Nancy Pelosi, that's the entertainment part, not necessarily the education part, but it can make the education part more fun and more palatable. There's always teachers, the best, everybody has a memory of a teacher they really loved who did something really cool. And sometimes it was something fun like that made learning fun. And I do believe in making learning fun. It's something I'm passionate about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Was there any other questions you had for me? You can ask me spicy ones too. I'll field any question.
So, do you consider yourself a revolutionary?
Do I consider myself a revolutionary? Damn. No, for the purpose of the Fed. No, just kidding. Nah. I mean, I guess I would consider myself a social revolutionary. In that I believe very much in pushing courageously and strongly for social change. I don't advocate for violence ever. I just don't. It's not what my platform is for. I'm an educator and that's not what I deal in. But I do believe in aggressively pushing for social change. I do believe in boldly pushing for social change. And I think that we shouldn't just accept the crumbs of whatever is offered to us by the Democratic Party or whatever is seen as acceptable at the moment. And I think that's reflected in my work to a certain degree. Of course, I'm limited because at the end of the day, I'm streaming on YouTube, so there's rules you have to obey and whatever.
Of course.
But yeah, I mean, I would consider myself a social revolutionary, in that I think that, again, much like what I said before, I do think that the key is changing the way that we engage with one another, and I think that's especially important in the age of the internet, where so many people are lost and lonely and don't have communities or fall into communities that are very toxic or culty or exploitative. And I think that we can really change the world if we can learn how to, solidify good practices for how to build safe communities, how to empower one another. And I think it could change the way that we see the world. And I think we're in a desperate need for change. We are in a place where specifically COVID, but also just late capitalism in general, has put us in a position where a lot of us don't even recognize the life that we used to live when we were younger. I know that's true for me. I'm 30, so I'm not that old, but the life that I and my peers live now is nothing like what it even was for our parents. I remember the way it was for my parents growing up, and there were plenty of downsides, but there was also this a very different world now, where everything is gig economy and everybody's scrounging for 3-4 jobs. Everybody I know is just,
at least they could afford a mortgage on a house.
Yeah, I mean, and not everybody. Obviously, there were people who were struggling and below the line, and poverty's always been an issue. But what you see now is that even those people who do have a house, those people are often have side hustles and all this shit. It's just the tension has been increasing and increasing and increasing, and it's to the point where I talk to other people my age, and it's they haven't had a get together with friends in years. They're just, I'm too busy. I'm always working. They haven't even gone to I grew up pretty poor, we used to have bonfires, cheap shit. You get a couple of shit from the dollar store, some of those crappy pies, and you hang out outside because you have a night that you can do that. But people don't have that anymore. Not only just because of, not only just because of COVID either. It's obviously this was before COVID. People are just, our society is rapidly changing, and I think that means that we need to embrace that change is coming, that change is here, and that we can evolve our society in a good way. We don't just have to let it fall in a bad way, if that makes sense. So
yeah, I think that's a good way to go about it. I would say, first off, that I am a political revolutionary. I do believe in revolution. I would say that, or not I would say, I am very much nonviolent. I'm something of a nonviolent revolutionary. We do exist. nonviolent revolutionary visibility.
Oh yeah.
I do believe in nonviolence specifically because for ethical reasons, but also just because violence doesn't seem to, in the modern first world like I live, doesn't seem to be a very effective way of achieving political change.
Yeah.
I believe political change is now achieved more than ever on places like the internet, organizing on the ground, organizing through economic structures, things like that.
Mm.
I'm a revolutionary because I do not at all trust the current institutions to institute any sort of leftist change or even progressive change unless forced to by the
Yeah.
ones below. So I would instead advocate for building leftist institutions under them until the institutions on top of us prove themselves inefficient and are overthrown by the institutions we are created.
Yeah. Well, I can certainly be on board with that. So maybe I am a political revolutionary then in that way. I'm certainly also a nonviolent person. I don't believe in that or advocate for it.
Violence is a
Yeah.
little cringe.
Yeah. It's
Though I understand why many in the global South would resort to that
Of
given their
course.
subjugation. I I am not subject to the same type of subjugation that they might be,
Hmm.
so I do not need to resort to those tactics.
Right. And also, I mean, I think even there's people here in the first world who are pressed into a place, and I would like to ideally see a system where people aren't pushed into a place where they're of that level of desperation, because it does often come out of desperation. I mean, we see this in especially in this time of COVID, like people there's like people are shoplifting essentials because they can't get their essentials. Like that's terrible.
Yeah.
You know, it's terrible that we've let our society get to a point where that's so normal. Yeah. Well, thank you so very much for coming on. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about or shout out or anything like that before we wrap this up? Because I am about to wrap up my own stream myself. I wanted to spend a little bit of time chatting with chat first, but
Oh yeah, no problem. My name is Lyss. You can find me at Social Lyss on Twitter. I plugged it in the chat when I first came on.
follow.
I suppose I could, I suppose I could say it again. Yeah, I'm a leftist academic of sorts. I talk theory with people. I try to educate people, and I'd also like to say that there's no real such thing as a learned person. We are all learning. We are all at different stages of learning. So, like, very much is the case that I am very much still learning myself. There's plenty of things that people know that I don't know, and there's plenty of things that I still need to be educated on myself. I'm still making my way through a book called Hood Feminism right now, which is a fantastic book. About a third of the way through it. It's really, really good. And mostly, where you can catch me is the RGR Discord, where I talk with my friends and talk about politics with people.
Our
The Last Samurai is right back.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Lyss. It's been wonderful. This has been a truly, truly wonderful conversation, and I hope that we can have
No
more in the
problem at
future.
all.
Thank you so much.
All right. You have a wonderful night.
You too. Thank you so much.